The late afternoon sun hung low and pale over the frozen Nevada basin, a weak white disk behind a veil of falling snow. The light was sharp and colorless as it hit the drifts that had been building since morning. Thane delicately guided his horse along the familiar, snow-packed trail toward his ranch, his movement slow and steady against the biting wind. The horse's hooves crunched rhythmically through the icy crust, breath puffing in thick white clouds around them. The air felt brittle and raw in Thane's throat, and each breath carried the stinging taste of winter. He shifted slightly in the saddle, rubbing a gloved hand across his jaw where ice had gathered in his stubble, trying to fight off the dull ache in his shoulders from a long day checking the perimeter fencing. His eye stayed locked on the line of cottonwoods in the distance, the skeletal markers he always checked first when coming home. They usually meant nothing more than the end of the day and the promise of a fire. But today, something tugged at his attention. A quick flicker of movement appeared near the split-rail fence, dark against the blinding white. He frowned and slowed the horse without thinking, leaning forward just a bit to peer through the flurry. The movement wasn't shaped like livestock and didn't shift like a wolf. It stayed low, too still, too quiet. A small knot of unease formed in his stomach. His land rarely saw visitors, and certainly not strangers without warning in this weather. As he approached, the shape sharpened in the grey evening light. A girl, maybe 8 years old, crouched near the fence post, half buried in a drift. Her arms hugged her chest tightly. Her thin frame trembled with violent shivers. She looked up only when his shadow crossed over her. Her eyes were almond-shaped, wide and dark, full of panic and a bone-deep exhaustion. Her face was pale, her lips blue from the cold, her black hair tangled with ice and snow. Her clothing was entirely unsuited for the weather, a thin tunic and trousers that looked foreign, torn and cinched badly at the waist with a strip of rope, as if she had been running and grabbed anything she could to keep moving. Thane stopped the horse and slid down slowly, his boots landing with a solid crunch in the snow. He kept his hands visible, palms open, trying not to show how fast his heartbeat had risen. He wasn't afraid of the child. He was afraid of what made her look like that. "You hurt?" he asked, keeping his tone level and low, his voice barely rising above the wind. She didn't speak. She just shook her head once, small and stiff. Her eyes flicked past him toward the white hills, her breathing breaking for a second, as though she expected someone or something to follow her through the storm. Thane followed her gaze and felt a thin line of tension pull through his back. Whatever scared her wasn't far away in her mind. He knew that look. He had seen it in men fleeing the war, and now in the eyes of a child who looked like she had walked farther than her body could handle. He crouched a little to meet her eye level, ignoring the wet snow soaking into his knees. "You alone out here?" No answer, just another fragile shake of her head. Meaning, no, she wasn't alone. Or no, she didn't want to say. He didn't press her. Pressing people in that state usually made things worse. She needed warmth first, not questions. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's get you out of the cold." When he reached for her, she flinched first, her shoulders jumping, but she didn't pull away. She was past the point of running. Thane lifted her carefully, shocked by how little weight she had, and set her on the horse. Her hands clung to the saddle horn immediately, small fingers gripping as if the leather was the only thing holding her to the earth. He walked beside the horse instead of climbing up, trudging through the drifts. He wanted her to feel control, not pressure. Her breathing slowed, but she kept glancing behind them, each time making his chest tighten a little more. Something bad had happened. Something recent. The cabin came into view as the sun dropped behind the ridge, turning the snow a bruised purple. Smoke rose from the chimney from the fire he had left banked that morning. Normally, that sight eased him. Today, it didn't. Not with a child he didn't know leaning weakly against the saddle and danger pressing in from the unknown whiteout. By the time they reached the small porch, the girl's grip had loosened, fatigue finally taking over. Thane lifted her down gently. She let him, her body cold and limp against his arm. Inside, he set her near the cast-iron stove and worked quickly, stirring the remaining embers and adding dry logs until heat pushed into the room, battling the draft. The girl didn't speak, She watched him with that same silent fear, as if she expected him to turn her away or ask questions she wasn't ready to face. He didn't. He wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders and pulled a chair closer to the warmth. "You're safe here," he said, unsure if she believed him, but needing to say it anyway. Her eyes softened just enough for him to see relief break through the fear. Thane stood near the frosted window, staring out at the fading light, watching the snowy hills while she drifted toward sleep. He kept turning over possibilities. Lost family, railroad workers, pursuers, a labor camp nearby. But each thought tightened his chest more. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who might come looking. But he knew this: the child was terrified, exhausted, and needed someone to stand between her and whatever she'd fled. And for tonight, that someone had to be him. The cabin warmed slowly as night settled across the basin. The orange light from the stove pushed back the cold in uneven patches along the floor. Thane kept the flame steady, feeding the fire small pieces of kindling so the heat wouldn't startle the girl or make noise that might worry her. She sat wrapped in the blanket he'd given, legs pulled close to her chest, her eyes flicking around the room as if she were mapping every corner for safety. He moved carefully, avoiding sudden sounds, pulling a tin cup from the shelf and filling it with warm water. When he handed it to her, she hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling more from nerves than exhaustion. "You can drink," he said quietly. She brought the cup to her lips, sipping slowly, her throat working hard with each swallow. Thane watched for signs of illness or injury, but all he saw was a child who had pushed herself far beyond what she should have. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She paused, gripping the cup tightly. Her voice, when it came, was thin and quiet, heavily accented. "Mai." He nodded once, letting her see he wasn't going to push her for more. "I'm Thane." Mai dipped her head, acknowledging him, then lowered her gaze back to the cup. He prepared food next, simple broth and a small bowl of rice he had in the pantry, softened in warm water. The cabin filled with a light, savory smell that eased the dryness in the air. Mai watched every motion, cautious but curious, her expression shifting between fear and relief. When he set the bowl in front of her, she froze again, waiting, judging, trying to decide if it was safe. Only when he stepped back a little did she allow herself a small bite. Her jaw moved slowly at first, then faster once she realized she could keep it down. Thane leaned against the table, arms crossed loosely, keeping enough distance that she didn't feel trapped. He let her eat without questions. If she wanted to speak, she would. After a few minutes, she stopped and looked toward the door, her brow tightening. "You expecting someone?" Thane asked in a low voice. She shook her head quickly, fear returning, her breath catching slightly. Thane followed her gaze to the door and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. He didn't know who or what she feared, but he recognized the way she kept checking the shadows. Like someone who had run from something still close behind her. Without saying anything, he walked to the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place with a soft click. Mai jumped at the sound, then relaxed slowly when she understood what he'd done. Her shoulders loosened and her breaths evened out. She finished the last of the rice and set the bowl down carefully, almost apologetically, as if she worried he might be upset by the use of his food. "You did fine," he reassured her. Mai reached into the small pouch tied poorly at her waist. She pulled out a woven bracelet made of red thread, thin, worn, and knotted with a complex design that had clearly been touched 1,000 times. She held it out to him with both hands, her expression serious. Thane didn't take it at first. "You don't have to give me anything." She pushed it forward again, her chin lifting slightly, insisting. He accepted it, feeling the texture. Soft threads, intricate knots, something made with care. Something important enough to carry when she ran. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mai nodded once, satisfied, then wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. Thane laid an extra quilt near the stove and gestured toward it. "You can sleep here. It's warmest." She moved without argument, settling onto the blanket, her eyes still tracking him even as she lay down. Thane sat at the table afterward, cleaning his rifle out of habit more than need, keeping the movement steady and soft so they wouldn't unsettle her. She watched him until her eyes finally drifted shut. Once her breathing settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, Thane looked toward the door again, his jaw clenched. He had taken in a stranger, a child carrying fear that didn't come from nowhere. Something or someone had driven her here through the snow. And whatever it was, he had a feeling it wasn't finished. The sun came up harsh and brilliant the next morning, reflecting off the white basin and slipping through the small cabin window in a single sharp line. Thane woke early, the kind of early that came from unease rather than routine. He sat up slowly on his cot, listening for anything unusual, movement outside, hoofbeats, voices, but the world stayed quiet except for the steady crackle of the stove he had kept burning low through the night. Mai was still asleep near the warmth, curled tightly under the quilt, her breathing soft and even. Seeing her rest so deeply eased him a little, but not enough to settle the tension in his chest. He pulled on his boots, shrugged into his heavy sheepskin coat, and stepped outside with his rifle in hand. The cold air hit him immediately, sharp and still. The ground held a fresh layer of powder that crunched under his steps as he moved toward the fence line. He scanned the horizon first, habit, instinct, and caution all working together, then dropped his gaze to the snow. Footprints. More than he expected. They weren't from Mai alone, and not old enough to ignore. Thane crouched, touching the edge of a boot track that cut deep into the frozen crust. It was fresh, yesterday afternoon, maybe evening, too close to the cabin for coincidence. Another print overlapped it, lighter, but matching direction. 2 men at least, possibly more. They had come near his land, walked along the fence, then turned back toward the ridge. His jaw tightened. He didn't like strangers approaching his property without making themselves known, especially when a frightened child appeared on the same day. He straightened, eyes narrowing at the distant hills. Whoever made those tracks had been moving quickly, searching. A flash of anger stirred low in his chest. Not loud, not wild, but controlled. The kind he hadn't felt since before he came to this valley. Someone had scared Mai badly enough to send her running through a blizzard. Someone had followed too close. He headed back to the cabin, boots crunching steadily over the snow, and paused at the door to calm himself. Mai didn't need to see anger, not even directed elsewhere. She had seen enough fear to last her a long time. Inside, the warmth hit again. Mai was awake, sitting up with a quilt around her shoulders. She looked at him with questioning eyes, not panicked like yesterday, but guarded. "You sleep all right?" he asked softly. She nodded once, but her gaze drifted toward the door as if she could sense something unsettled in him. Thane set the rifle against the wall and knelt near her so she didn't feel towered over. "You're safe here," he said, keeping his tone even. "Nothing's coming in." But Mai wasn't reassured. She tightened the blanket and looked toward the window, her breath picking up. She had seen him notice the tracks. Even without words, she could tell something was wrong. Thane debated telling her everything he'd found, but she was too young, too raw from whatever she'd fled. So he said, "Only some men pass by. They're gone now." Her shoulders jumped slightly, fear hitting hard enough to shake her control. She clenched her hands, breathing faster. Thane didn't reach out. He knew better than to crowd someone when panic rose, but he softened his voice. "They didn't see you," he added. "And they didn't come inside. You're safe." Mai swallowed hard, then nodded, though her eyes stayed wet. He stood and pulled out a small piece of bread and warm broth, setting them on the table. "Eat what you can. We'll take things slow today." She moved toward the food, still watching him in case he left again. To give her something grounding, something small and steady, he pointed to the red thread bracelet she had given him last night. "This yours?" he asked gently. She nodded again. "I'll keep it safe," he said. "You don't have to worry about that." Something in her expression softened. Not trust, but a small shift toward comfort. After breakfast, Thane took her outside for a moment, holding her hand loosely so she could pull away if she wanted. The cold air hit her face, and she flinched, but she didn't back away. He showed her the horse, the barn, the yard. He didn't mention the tracks. She didn't ask, but every few minutes she glanced toward the ridge, toward where the tracks led, toward where danger might still be waiting. Thane saw it each time, and each time he felt the same steady resolve build stronger in him. Whoever had chased her, whoever had made her run until she nearly collapsed at his fence, they wouldn't get anywhere near her again. The afternoon light thinned as the hours passed, settling into that pale quiet that came before evening. Thane worked near the barn, repairing a loose stall door with slow, controlled movements. But his mind kept drifting back to the tracks he'd seen in the morning. Whoever had circled his land had done it recently. Whoever they weren't wandering. They had a purpose, and he didn't like that it involved a frightened child now sleeping under his roof. Mai stayed close to the cabin door while he worked, holding a small tin cup of water with both hands. She wasn't shaking like the night before, but she still had that alert stillness of someone trying to judge how much safety the day could offer. Every time the wind shifted, she looked toward the ridge. Thane hammered another nail in place and paused to wipe sweat from his temple despite the cold. That's when he noticed Mai stiffen sharply. Her grip tightened around the cup. Her eyes fixed on something behind him, something up on the ridge. Thane turned slowly, following her stare. A lone figure was descending the snowy slope, moving with extreme effort, plowing through drifts that were knee-deep. At first, he reached for his rifle, instincts rising fast, but he stopped when the figure stepped into better light. It was a woman. Her steps were unsteady, one hand bracing against the rocks as she made her way down. She wore a heavy, tattered coat, but beneath it, the flash of color was unmistakable, a high-collared dress of deep blue silk, a traditional cheongsam, dirty and torn at the hem, decorated with intricate embroidery that looked out of place against the harsh, white landscape. Her hair, long and black, was loose and windblown. Her breathing looked heavy even from a distance, blowing in white plumes. Mai gasped, not with fear this time, but with recognition. "Mama," she whispered, the word breaking out of her like something she'd been holding in for too long. Thane didn't move at first. Relief hit him, relief for the girl, but it mixed with new tension. If this woman was her mother, then Mai hadn't been wandering aimlessly. She'd been running to or from something, and her mother had been close behind. The woman reached the bottom of the slope, stumbled once, caught herself, then looked across the yard. Her eyes locked on Mai. They widened, filling with raw relief so clear it stopped Thane's breath for a moment. Mai ran first. Quick steps, small feet kicking up snow. The woman dropped to her knees despite the pain it clearly caused her and caught the girl in her arms with a strength born more from need than physical power. She held Mai tightly, pressing her face against her daughter's hair, closing her eyes as if grounding herself in the reality of the moment. Thane stepped forward then, slow and cautious, not wanting to intrude. When the woman finally looked up, her arms still around Mai, her expression shifted. Relief gave way to guarded assessment. Her eyes, dark and steady, traveled over Thane carefully, measuring him, trying to understand who he was and why her daughter was on his land. "My name is Lin," she said in a low, controlled voice. Her English was clear, though edged with exhaustion. She straightened slightly, wincing at the movement but hiding it quickly. I followed her tracks. Thane nodded once, keeping his posture easy. She found my place last night. She was cold, hungry, scared. I gave her shelter. Lin glanced down at Mai, who still clung to her side, then back at Thane. Her jaw tightened for a brief second. A mix of gratitude and caution. The kind of caution that came from a life where trust could get someone killed. "You helped her," she said softly. It wasn't a question. She needed it. Lin's gaze drifted toward the ridge again, and Thane didn't miss the small shift in her breathing. The way her shoulders tensed when she looked back toward the direction she came from. There was something out there, something that made even a strong woman look over her shoulder. Thane took a small step back, giving them space. "You're both welcome inside. You look like you've been walking since dawn." Lin hesitated, not because she doubted the invitation, but because accepting help meant lowering defenses. But Mai tugged gently at her coat, tired and cold, and that settled her decision faster than anything Thane could have said. With a short nod, Lin rose, keeping a firm grip on her daughter. When she walked, Thane noticed the slight limp in her step, the silent wince each time her weight landed on her right leg. He also noticed she tried to hide it from Mai. Inside the cabin, the air grew warmer from the stove, and Mai sank onto the blanket she'd slept under the night before. Lin stayed standing for a moment, scanning the room, making sure nothing threatened her daughter. Only when she felt certain did she finally sit near the stove, her breath shaking faintly from exhaustion she no longer had the strength to conceal. Thane watched quietly from the doorway. Mai wasn't lost anymore. But the danger that had driven both mother and child here. That part wasn't finished. Not yet. The cabin settled into a different kind of stillness once Lin stepped inside. A quiet that came not from emptiness, but from three people trying to understand whether they were truly safe. Thane kept his distance at first, leaning his rifle by the door and giving Lin space to sit without feeling watched. The stove warmed the room steadily, casting a soft glow along the wooden walls. Mai stayed close to her mother, her small hands gripping the side of Lin's cheongsam as if afraid she might disappear if she let go. Lin brushed her fingers gently through Mai's hair, each movement slow and deliberate, but Thane could see the strain in her breathing. "You both need food," Thane said, moving to the stove. His voice stayed calm, quiet, careful not to overwhelm either of them. Lin nodded once but didn't speak. Her eyes followed him with a mixture of weariness and gratitude. He prepared what he had, broth with bits of venison and more rice. The smell filled the cabin, and my stomach growled loud enough for her to startle at the noise. Thane set the bowls on the table, then stepped back. "Eat," he said gently. Mai moved first, climbing onto the chair. Lin remained standing for a moment, watching the girl, watching Thane, then finally taking a slow breath before sitting. The first spoonful hit her harder than she expected. Thane saw it in her face, the way her eyes closed briefly, the way her shoulders eased as the heat of the food reached her empty stomach. It wasn't pleasure she felt, just relief that bordered on pain. "You've been without food a while," Thane said, not accusing, just observing. Lin kept her eyes on her bowl. "We left the camp quickly. There was no time to take anything." Thane didn't ask why. "Not yet." She wasn't ready. Halfway through the meal, Lin shifted in her seat, and a small tremor ran through her right leg. She tried to hide it by adjusting her posture, but the movement only made the strain more obvious. When she reached for her cup, her hand shook slightly. "You're hurt," Thane said quietly. She stiffened, her jaw locked. "It's nothing." "That limp says otherwise," he replied. Thane retrieved a small tin from the shelf. "Pine salve." Simple but effective, he placed it on the table beside her without touching her. "This helps with pain. Use it if you want." Lin stared at the tin as if it was something fragile. She didn't reach for it first. She looked toward Mai, who had stopped eating to watch them. Only after seeing her daughter calm and fed did Lin finally pick up the salve. "Thank you," she said quietly. After the meal, Lin sat near the stove, rolling up the hem of her trousers to reveal a bruised and swollen ankle. Thane busied himself sharpening a knife at the table to give them privacy, but he heard the intake of breath when she applied the salve. "Men chased us," Lin said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Thane didn't look up, keeping the scrape of metal steady. "The tracks I saw." "Yes," she said. "Railroad foreman. They claimed debts that were not owed. When I refused, they became violent. Mai saw. We ran." Thane stopped sharpening the knife. He looked at her then, seeing the steel behind her exhaustion. "They won't find you here." "They are persistent," Lin warned. "So am I," Thane said. The next morning, the wind carried a colder bite than usual. Thane stepped outside before the sun fully cleared the ridge, scanning the land. Inside, he could hear faint movement, Lin stirring awake, Mai asking for water. But the peace didn't settle long. Thane's stomach pulled tight when he looked toward the far end of the property. The snow kicked up there wasn't natural. It moved in a steady, deliberate way. Hoofbeats. More than one horse coming in fast. Thane's grip tightened around the rifle, his jaw clenching as he took a step forward. 3 riders broke into view, coats flapping, guns at their sides. Men who looked like they didn't ride for conversation. He stepped up onto the porch and planted himself squarely in front of the door. The riders slowed when they reached the fence line. The lead man shifted in his saddle, eyes sweeping the yard. "Morning," he called, voice carrying easily across the snow. "We're looking for a couple strays. A Chinese woman and a girl. Pass this way." Thane didn't move. His expression stayed flat. "Haven't seen anyone cross here." The man squinted. "Tracks say otherwise." Thane shrugged. Snow drifts do strange things to tracks. A second rider leaned forward, spitting into the snow. "Funny thing. The tracks led right to your fence." Thane felt heat rise under his skin, but he kept it buried. "Not my business who passes. My land's quiet. I keep it that way." The lead rider shifted, frustrated. He scanned the windows of the cabin, trying to see inside. Thane stepped forward half a pace, just enough to block the view. "You mind?" the rider asked sharply. "I do," Thane answered, tone flat but leaving no room for misunderstanding. A long pause stretched between them, heavy and brittle. Finally, the lead man clicked his tongue. "If they come this way, you send word. They're property of the company." Thane didn't respond. The man's jaw twitched, but he pulled the reins and turned his horse. The others followed. Only when they disappeared behind the rise did Thane exhale. He stepped backward into the doorway and closed the cabin door quietly. Inside, Lynn stood near the stove, my clutch tight against her side. "They found us," she said, voice low. "They didn't see anything here," Thane said. "They won't get another chance if I can help it." Lynn studied him carefully. "You took a risk for us." "I did what needed doing." Mai peeked up at him, her eyes wide. Less fear, more trust. Something inside Thane shifted at that look. "We'll stay inside today," he said. "I'll keep watch." Lynn nodded slowly. She wasn't used to relying on others, but the way she looked at Thane told him she understood he meant every word. The days that followed passed with a tense kind of quiet. The sunlight outside grew stronger, but no one stepped outdoors. Inside, a new routine formed. Lynn, her ankle healing, took over the cooking. She used the simple supplies Thane had, flour, dried meat, rice, and turned them into meals that tasted of spices he didn't know he had in his pantry. She moved with a grace that the rough cabin had never seen. Mai followed Thane everywhere he went inside the small space. She watched him mend tools, clean the hearth, and oil the leather of his tack. He found himself explaining things to her, how to check a cinch, how to tell if wood was dry enough to burn. She absorbed it all. One evening, Thane sat at the table whittling a small piece of pine. Lynn sat opposite him, mending the tear in her cheongsam with a needle and thread she'd found in his kit. The firelight danced over the silk, making the blue fabric shimmer. "You have lived here long?" Lynn asked, her voice soft. 5 years, Thane said. "Built it myself." "It is strong," she said. "Like its maker." Thane looked up, surprised by the compliment. Lynn met his gaze, and for the first time, her guard was fully down. In the warm light, she was beautiful, not just resilient, but gentle. It was lonely, Thane admitted, a truth he hadn't spoken aloud before. Until now. Lynn's hands paused on the silk. "We ran from a hard life," she said. "But perhaps we ran toward something better." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. As the weeks passed and the snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath, the danger felt distant. But the cabin had become too small for 3 people who were no longer strangers. One afternoon, Thane stood outside, measuring the side of the cabin. Lynn came out to join him, wrapping her coat tight against the lingering chill. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Thinking," Thane said. "About adding on a second room. Wood's cut, just needs assembling." Lynn looked at the space he was measuring. "A room for what?" Thane turned to her. He looked at Mai, who was playing near the porch, digging in the slush. Then he looked back at Lynn. "For family. If they want to stay." Lynn's breath caught. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "You would want us to stay?" "Permanently." "I don't want you to leave," Thane said, his voice rough but honest. "I want to protect you. I want this." He gestured between them. Lynn reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. The touch was careful, deliberate. "I have not known safety in a long time, Thane. But I have found it here." She smiled, a rare, genuine expression that lit up her face. "And I have found more than safety." Thane covered her hand with his own. It was rough and calloused against her smooth skin, but she didn't pull away. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his shoulder. "Then we build," Thane said softly. "Yes," Lynn whispered. "We build." Mai ran toward them then, holding up a shiny rock she'd found in the mud. She squeezed between them, taking both their hands. Thane looked down at the girl, then at the woman who had brought life back into his frozen world. The riders might come back. The winter would come again next year. But as Thane looked at the foundation of the new room he would build, he knew they would face it all together. He had taken in a stray, but he had found a future. And in the quiet of the Nevada basin, the lone rancher finally knew what it meant to be home.